Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm John O'Loughlin. Welcome to McDuff Lives, and thank you so much for sticking with us as Harley Schlanger is back. We have reconnected after an internet problem in Europe, so sorry about that, but grateful to Harley to make time for us to go ahead and have a show today. So thanks, Harley. Welcome. Thanks for being with me once again, my friend.
Well, we missed the session 2 weeks ago because I wasn't around, so I certainly didn't want to miss another one. There's so much going on, so much to process, and so much lying that we have to cut through. So I'm very happy that we were able to have this program today.
Yeah, a friend of mine said this a few minutes ago. The world is heading full speed toward a brick wall right now. And those of us that see how bad it is have got to just keep working to get the word out. Now, was this internet glitch? Is this maybe part of the problem? The control people behind the scenes exerting control over the internet?
Well, as you know, we've been pointing out that NATO has been working with the secret service in Ukraine to try to limit what they call pro-Russian narrative. And they just put out a press release the other day that was Zelensky appointed a new person to head the SBU cybersecurity, who said that they are going to aggressively move to silence any pro-Putin narrative. Now, what is a pro-Putin narrative? Anyone who contests the NATO line that the fight in Ukraine is about defending democracy and freedom from the barbarian Putin. If you disagree with that, you're a Putin puppet. And now the EU is putting through cyber capability, central control, where they can shut down programs over and above the platform. So it's not just the platforms now doing the censorship, it's being done by the NATO and the European Union. So whether that was the problem today or not, I'm not sure. It just kept saying Chrome cannot sync with Google, and it shut down my session. But my update in Europe on BitChute was shut down today. So, and it said because I was encouraging violence, which, as you know, I never do. So what we're dealing with is a real push toward war. And that's what I wanted to just lay out in the very beginning, because we had these very ominous reports of a leak of a discussion by the top man in the German Air Force, top general in the German Air Force, with three of his subordinates, talking on February 19th for almost a half hour about how to use Taurus missiles in Ukraine. Now, the Taurus missiles, the German Chancellor Scholz said, we're not providing Taurus missiles. And yet his Air Force is talking about using them and trying to figure out how to use them so that the Russians won't know it's being done by the Germans. But in their discussion, they said the Ukrainians can't use these properly, can't target them properly. So the Germans will have to have the personnel to do the targeting and the operation. And among the things they discussed was sneaking people into Ukraine through Poland. Now, there are more specifics than that, but what the German media is focused on is who leaked this? How did this get into the Russian press? Instead of what this means, which is the top officials of the German army were caught discussing Germany going to war against Russia, because the Taurus missiles shot from Ukraine could hit Moscow. They could hit the Russian nuclear arsenal. Then you have Macron at an EU meeting saying that he would not rule out NATO boots on the ground in Ukraine. By the way, one of the other things the Germans said is that there are 3 other NATO countries already in Ukraine, and they talked about English and American accents. So we know the UK, the US, probably the French also. So here we see an escalation, and Biden pushing to get more money to Ukraine, the Europeans voting more money, the expansion of NATO, the largest NATO maneuvers ever, the Steadfast Defender 24 going on right now. Ukraine targeting the Russian fleet in the Black Sea. Now, why is all this happening? Because the war is lost. Everyone knows it now. But they're not going to stop it, because the intention of the war was not to defend Ukraine, but to grind Ukraine down to weaken Russia. And so what we've been saying for the last 2 years since the special military operation started, and long before that, going back to the Maidan coup, the Minsk betrayal, and so on, what we've been saying is that this is a NATO operation on behalf of the City of London and Wall Street to defeat and, if possible, destroy Russian military capability so that Russia will not serve as a force opposing the great reset of the great global bankers' dictatorship. Now, instead, Russia's gotten stronger, China's gotten stronger, the global South is in rebellion. When they see this kind of discussion coming from NATO, then it makes it clear to them that they have to choose between two sides, and the global South has already chosen not to support the West. Now, then you add to that what we're seeing in Gaza, where there's plenty of coverage now on the internet of the lies the Israeli Defense Forces were telling about the Flower Massacre, the so-called Flower Massacre, where over 120 Palestinians were killed as they were swarming to food deliveries of flour, at a point where the UN official for World Hunger said 500,000 Palestinians are now in a starvation situation. And there have been some starvation deaths in the last couple of days. Now, the question that was just raised by Christiane Amanpour, who's not an opponent of Israel and Netanyahu by any sense of the imagination, she was questioning Mark Regev, the spokesman for the IDF, about the lies the Israelis are telling about all these people were killed by a stampede. And she said, but the IDF admitted shooting. The doctors who treated the dead said there were bullets. These are not made up by the Hamas. This is reality. And Regev said, no, you can't trust anything they say. So this kind of escalation of killing in Gaza, that's in northern Gaza. There's still the question of, will Israel storm Rafah in southern Gaza? So I wouldn't say we're headed toward a brick wall. We're headed toward a nuclear war. And meanwhile, what's Biden's response when he was questioned about the Flower Massacre? He was calmly licking an ice cream cone saying, well, we do want to get more humanitarian aid to the Palestinians. Well, then you had Kamala Harris on the commemoration of the attack during the civil rights movement on the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama, use that occasion to essentially seemingly change U.S. policy. She said, we want an immediate ceasefire. Well, then why does the U.S. keep vetoing that at the UN? If the U.S. wants a ceasefire and Israel won't give it, why not cut off the weapons and the money? So we're seeing blatant lies being told. Now, it may be Harris is floating a trial balloon, because, John, you and I can go through the upcoming, or the events in the last days showing that Biden's in big trouble in the election. And maybe they're going to try to change policies. Maybe they're going to try and change candidates. Who knows? But we are reaching a point of no return in these two wars. And then on top of that, the report from the Institute for International Finance that said debt is growing globally and in the US at unprecedented levels and unsustainable levels. So you see the conjuncture of the financial collapse with the war threat. So we need people speaking out to stop these wars, speaking out against the Biden policy, against the NATO policy, against the Netanyahu policy. We need more political figures to do what Lula, the president of Brazil, did. And that's what's driving me right now, to try and make sure that we get this story out. And that's why I appreciate the fact that we could still get this program on despite some of the internet problems.
Yeah, me too. I mean, it's always my pleasure and an honor to hear what's going on from your point of view. I'll confess to you, I've been a little bit away from the news because I've been absolutely fascinated by this new book I've got called The Sleeper Agent by A.W. Finnegan. And in which he introduces a concept that I never would have thought of, but it's really occupying my mind, and that is the idea of strategic bioweapons and the development of really nasty viruses and bugs by the Nazis during World War II that have been taken over by various people, both the Soviets, the Americans, the British, the French, and these things are an ongoing attempt not at killing people on a battlefield, but attacking entire populations. And the vector that everybody is familiar with is Lyme disease, and something that they've engineered and put out into the environment. And now millions and millions of people are suffering from the consequences of just that one thing. The book itself contains evidence of a huge program on the part of the Soviets to infect our population in America with these long-term disease vectors, such as the infamous SV40, which I believe I took when I took a sugar cube back in the 1960s for the polio virus vaccine. So, in essence, I have been absolutely fascinated and at the same time frightened by what I'm reading about the future for health of people in this country and in the world, based upon a strategic application of viruses and nasty stuff.
John, let me give you a personal anecdotal story. My uncle Sidney Baum, at the end of World War II, he was in the Army. He had a chemistry degree from, I think, MIT, and he was brought into the OSS to go into Germany to investigate what farben and what the other German chemicals were developing as chemical warfare. And after 4 months of investigation, his program was shut down and taken over by British intelligence. And the Americans were all told to leave. And he never talked about that until just before he passed away. But he was quite incensed that nobody understood that the soldiers, the people working for the OSS, were actually trying to find out what was going on, and was kept from them by the British. So I don't know if there's any stories about that. He spent time in Heidelberg and in Stuttgart, where you had major biological and chemical warfare operations. Now, speaking of that, when was the last time we heard anything about the biological warfare factories that were set up in Ukraine that were operated by the United States? That's been, after Victoria Nuland acknowledged that, nothing more has been said. And by the way, I don't know if you heard this, but Victoria Nuland announced her retire, or Blinken announced that Nuland is going to retire today. She's one of the more evil people around. It doesn't mean that she's probably going to go to a think tank where she'll have more control over U.S. policy.
Oh, I don't know. Let's just send her to Morocco and set her on a bar stool with an endless supply of mojitos and whatever else she likes. Maybe a little something to smoke. Just get her out of our lives. My God. Oh, but the labs are still there, and one of the many awesome and amazing themes that I learned from this book is how of course the Americans were doing it too, and they did a lot of nasty stuff in the Korean War.
Yeah.
And they've been experimenting on their own people, just like the Germans did, and just like the Soviets have done in huge but unspoken experiments. And so what's happened is that when the Americans learned about the extent of these Soviet efforts against us, the Soviets had already evidence of what the Americans had been doing. And so in order to avoid the American people knowing what the American spooks had been doing, and in Korea and in our own country, some kind of an under the table deal arose between the politicians of the Soviets, the Americans, and the Brits to just not talk about it, to just keep it all under the table, and we'll fight amongst each other, but we're not going to let the people know. And this book is explosive because it lays it all out, and right in the center of it, Harley, is none other than Great Britain through the Cambridge Apostles.
Yeah.
These are the guys that were running things back and forth. It's not, we know about the nuclear, but what this book is showing is the biological and the horror of what they've been able to do so far. That's why I think I, in the context of which I was thinking, with the world running into a brick wall, because the more this stuff is ignored and not addressed, it's going to get past a tipping point where we can't fix it, and that to me is very critical. So anyway, that's the world from my point of view today.
Let me come back to this question of Macron and NATO boots on the ground, the German generals talking about Taurus missiles in the hands of the Ukrainians and so on. The former head, NATO chief of staff for Southern Europe, retired General Fabio Mini, did an interview yesterday where he said, what do you think's going to happen if missiles from Ukraine are fired by Germans into Russia? And he said, everyone's talking about how Putin's threatening nuclear war, which he said Putin is not threatening. But what do you think Russia's response is going to be? They only have one response ultimately, which is they will assume that Germany and France are at war with them, and they will strike. Now, whether they strike with nuclear weapons or not, Meany wasn't saying. But Scott Ritter said the same thing. He said Europe is on automatic pilot toward confrontation with Russia. Now, this is happening while we have the U.S. Congress has at least temporarily shut down the pipeline for weapons and money to Ukraine. But the Europeans have not. And Biden is still pushing for that. And I think that there's going to be a possibility to get a break from the Republican side by Biden. Or if not, what the Republicans are looking toward is if Ukraine collapses, they'll say it's Biden who lost Ukraine. And now Biden will say, no, the Republicans lost it by not funding the weapons. Why don't they just say, look, Ukraine was lost from February 2022. It was lost in the 8 years after the Maidan coup, when the West refused to negotiate in good faith with the Russians, where there could have been an agreement. Then in March 2022, there was an agreement initialed by the Ukrainian negotiator that was shut down by Boris Johnson on behalf of NATO. So why is NATO so committed to continuing a war which is destroying the young generation of Ukrainians? And this is where you have to start looking now at the bigger picture and look at the financial side of things. What's happening from the developing sector, the global south or the former colonies that are reacting against the neo-colonial policies of the Europeans and the Americans and the Canadians. They're reacting against it. They're kicking the French out of French West Africa. I was sort of joking the other day when I said, I think maybe Macron decided he'll take on Russia because he's had his butt kicked out by the people of Niger and Burkina Faso. But in any case, why are they so insistent on continuing these wars? If they don't get an agreement to allow the continued exploitation of these resource-rich but very poor countries, the Western economies will collapse. The debt situation is unbelievable. We've added almost $3 trillion to the U.S. Treasury debt since June of last year when the debt ceiling was raised. $2.9 trillion in 9 months. That's a rate of nearly $4 trillion a year, and it's going to increase because of the high interest rates with the new borrowing to cover the old debt. Europe is the same thing. So we're on a trajectory toward a financial blowout. The Community Bank of New York, or New York Community Bank, I think it's called, which took over the Signature Bank, which collapsed last year, had to write off $2.4 billion in uncollectible debts. They're headed toward a bailout. There's discussion from the Federal Reserve that the bailout and the bail-in policy may have to be brought in between the period now and the election. And what's Biden's election campaign about? War and bailouts. The subsidies for windmills and solar power, the so-called green policy, the military expenditure, almost $1 trillion in the official defense budget. So this is where you see automatic pilot towards war. And when you listen to the Congress, where are the voices of reason? They don't exist. It's a huge tragedy. If we have a William Shakespeare among us today, and if we survive this period, this would be the equivalent of the Richard III play, or even Hamlet. What happened to leaders at a point at which there could have been an exit ramp off the course toward war? Well, they're corrupt, they're immoral, they're cowardly, they're looking for a payday. And that's the crisis we face.
Gold. Gold is on the rise, I see.
And
Bitcoin
Bitcoin.
Bitcoin is out of sight, and still rising, which I don't understand. To me, having read about the way the Nugan Bank and other banks were set up, and then people invest in it and they invest their savings in it, and boom, the one day it's just not there. And I'm afraid that people in Bitcoin, maybe if you're really smart, you can make money at it. If I had invested 3 years ago, I'd be making money at it, but I wouldn't be smart enough to sell it at the right time. I'd wait for it to 100,000 a piece, and then I'd, but it'll never get there. And then I'll anyway, the point I wanted to get to was this about gold. J.P. Morgan, which is one of my favorite quotes, said, "Gold is money. All else is credit." The gold is what the real elites value. And he being part of what you and I call the synarchy, the people that are trying to take over everything, I think that is where I would aim, because I just saw a chart, and I think it's easy to find on the internet, of what country has the most gold. The United States has 4 times more gold than any other country, it says on that chart. Now, of course, that's not sitting in a bank account called the Citizens of the United States gold account. It's sitting in somebody else's, probably Goldman Sachs or some other huge financial institution. And to what extent is it really in America at all? Although this graph says it is, that means it's part of the American economy. Well, as you know, back in, I think it was 1933, the country was in some trouble and we needed to get some gold. So we passed a law that confiscated everybody's gold in exchange for pieces of paper called dollars. And everybody had to turn in their gold. And that was because Uncle Sam was in trouble. And guess what? Uncle Sam's in trouble again. So we have a precedent. We can just pass a law that says all the gold in the United States economy, and, have catchback provisions and go out and grab it, is now confiscated, and it now belongs to the United States Treasury under the complete control of Congress. That way, we would then have the bulk of what the elites value, course, we'd have to use our military to grab it. They're not going to just hand it to us, but we would take it back based on the necessity of our country. We need it. And then when the gold is gone from underneath of all their pieces of paper, then they won't have to go through bankruptcy. They'll all flop anyway. And we'll come up with some new currency, perhaps even some actual coinage, as the Constitution calls for, minting some real money that people can really hold as value, a basket of precious metals or something in some way to hold, just to actually have real value in your hand, and restore the hope of the people of this country that we can actually work as an empire of liberty, as Jefferson called it, or as just as a republic of free and independent sovereign citizens that work together for mutual benefit, and become moral again, and talk about the golden rule and how important it is that we treat each other with in the way that we would like to be treated, no matter who you are or how rich you are or what color you are. Everybody gets the same treatment and everybody respects one another. The only way to get back to it is to take the foundation out from under their wealth. And to me, if J.P. Morgan said it, it's probably right. So confiscate the gold.
Well, I'll give you an addendum to that, which is that ultimately gold has been treated as a medium of value throughout history, but gold itself is not a source of wealth. And that's where credit comes in. And this is where J.P. Morgan is a liar. As Hamilton said, a well-managed debt, meaning credit that actually goes to something that produces value, is a national blessing. And the question is, who controls it? And that's more to the point when you have private bankers like J.P. Morgan, who could use the Federal Reserve to determine who gets credit and who doesn't, and who is backed up by the government and who isn't. You look at 2008, what happened? They decided they were going to let Lehman Brothers go. It nearly crashed the whole system. So what did they do? They pumped money in, $23 to $27 trillion of liquidity to bail out the whole system. That lasted for 11 years. By 2019, we again were in another crisis where the debt was so large. And if you had gold money, but you still had a policy which didn't distinguish between productive value and speculation, you'd still have a problem. Our problem is not that we don't have enough gold or we don't have a gold system. Our problem is we have private interests that control the government and determine the flow of funds, the flow of credit, the flow of liquidity. And so we have a situation where there are a number of bankrupt companies that are insolvent, but are full of liquidity because of the policies of the Federal Reserve. So who should be the ones determining the credit policy? And this is where you get to the deeper problem, John. The deeper problem is that we have people in the Congress who don't know how to think about these things. They think in terms of dollars and cents. Maybe some of them think in terms of gold and silver, but they don't think in terms of productive value, improvements in technology that allow for productivity gains. And the United States has been fortunate in much of its history in that we were not ruled by bankers, but industrialists. The problem is that when industries got larger, they became monopolies because of the way the laws were shifted, so that you now had corporate cartels that were not just finance, but also across the board, including pharmaceuticals, including food production, and so on. So the question is, how do you have a government which acts in the interests of the people? And how can you do that if the people are overweight, sitting around binging on Netflix or Super Mario Brothers or something of that sort? We've lost a lot of the morality that we had coming out of World War II. Your father's generation, my father's generation, people who fought in a war to save humanity. But then when they got back from the war, they were trying to make up for lost time and turned their back on the people who got us into the war in the first place. And that's the people like the Dulles brothers and the offspring of the Dulles brothers who are controlling the agenda now. And you can trace it through people like Samuel Huntington, Brzezinski, Kissinger, Madeleine Albright, down to Blinken and Sullivan. And then you add in the Sullivan and Cromwell lawyers who write the laws from the top. And that's the problem we have. We've lost this sense of civic responsibility, what you were talking about earlier, morality. And if you don't have people who are grounded in the idea that we're all human beings and we all have inalienable rights, if you take that away, then what you're left with is this identity politics, which pits people against each other. Geopolitics in terms of nations, pitting nations against each other, pitting groups within nations against each other. And look at the mess we have. We don't have a sense of common purpose. There's no sense of common purpose in the United States right now. This red and blue division, socialist versus right-wing racist, all of these phrases are a deflection from the reality, which is that what is our national mission? And that's what we've lost. And sometimes in the past, it took a depression collapse or a war to bring some people to the fore who operated against that. And that was, I think, what Lincoln did. That's what FDR was trying to do. That's what John Kennedy was trying to do. Even Eisenhower, in a limited way, had a sense of that. But since the assassination of Kennedy, we've not had leaders who operated from that standpoint. And without leaders, the population will sink back into a less defined moral situation. That's the morality of production and the morality of a fight for the future. So, look, it's a big mess. And the best we can do is give people an understanding of how we got here and what are some of the solutions. And that's what we at the Schiller Institute and the LaRouche Organization try to do every day.
I absolutely agree with you about credit policy. And I guess my only addition to what you were saying is that if we had a national $1 trillion of gold that was ours, that belonged to the country, then people would be a lot more likely to borrow money from us, or to lend us money, or to invest in bonds, and to respect the fact that this country is not going to go under, and even if the currency goes under. That's the thing. Right now, just by pumping more currency and more currency, well, the same people are going to keep control through Sullivan and Cromwell. And as you know, I mean, Sullivan and Cromwell, when they found that different states had different corporate laws, and you could start a corporation in Rhode Island, that the government was able to fit it to Sullivan and Cromwell's perfect needs. And then they took that law and they went to Texas, and they went all around the country. And, with enough money and enough skilled lawyers, they were able to unify everything under the Uniform Commercial Code, where everybody just kind of is subject to this economy. But we can't have sovereignty without control over the economy. And the economy is no longer in the control of our government, if it ever was. Because that's why we have, the influences of the World Economic Forum. And that's why the UN is able to pass crazy things, and why NATO is able to do what it does. Because the United States does not have sovereignty, because it's just like Rothschilds famously said, they've got the control over our currency. The Federal Reserve is not federal, and it's not there for us. It's for the elites that formed it, in 1913 or whatever.
It's owned by the private banks, and its policies largely come from the New York Federal Reserve. which is an institution that's controlled by 5 or 6 banks. And their interest and the interests of the mother and father who are working to try and keep a roof over their head and put food on the table, their interests are very different. The interest of the Federal Reserve is to make sure there's enough liquidity to back up the inflated face value of the financial instruments they're trading. Think about it this way. This is where the derivative question becomes so significant. If you have something like 2 gigabillion or trillion dollars worth of derivatives out there, or actually, I guess it's quadrillion. If you have quadrillions of dollars of face values that are being traded, the traders can make money every single day if money is being printed and circulated to them, so that if someone tries to cash in or short sell their bonds, they have the liquidity to defeat them. But what does that mean for the economy? It means inflation. It means cutoff of credit to real producers, to entrepreneurs, to people who want to build infrastructure. And I was just in the U.S. for the first time in a while 2 weeks ago, and going through American airports and on American mass transit, so-called, it's really quite frightening. But the same thing's true in Germany now. The mass transit system here, which 30 years ago, 20 years ago was one of the best in the world, is terrible right now. I was bumped off 2 trains in the last couple of months because they had sick employees that they couldn't replace. The idea of redundancy, the idea of the importance of the transport corridors and of the electricity. And then you have the insanity of trying to move to electric vehicles when there's a shortage of electricity because of the green policy. You name it. I have to say, when I came to Germany in 2016, I had the illusion that Germany had world-class infrastructure, machine tool capability, auto sector, and that's being destroyed. It's being driven into the ground. German auto companies are moving lock, stock, and barrel to China. They're shutting down their enterprises inside Germany, and no one's saying a word about it. We saw the Nord Stream pipeline, which was a promise for unlimited, regularly delivered cheap oil and gas for not into the distant future, blown up probably by the United States, and the Germans did nothing. Just this last week, the Swedes and the Danes shut down their investigation of who blew up the Nord Stream pipelines. Did you hear about this? Well, no, of course you didn't, because they said we're not going to report what we found. So did anyone say, why not? It's like the Kennedy assassination. Where are the documents? Where is the truth? It's out there, but it's not, doesn't get through these secret government networks that are operating for what you were just talking about, the private sector, the private industry.
Well, you remind me of a reference I wanted to give you back about your uncle's experience, and that is the first book by John Loftus called The Belarus Secret.
Yeah.
And in that book, which I'm halfway through now, this is the time period of my dad's FBI career, from 1950 to 1962, and in that period is when the Belarusian Nazis are being shipped into the United States with or without permission. The powers that be, the State Department generally, are bringing them in, and that control over the whole population of Belarus, that huge area, twice the size of Poland, was completely Nazified and completely. They extinguished more Jews there, I imagine, than anywhere else. It's just a horrifying story. But these are the bad guys that played along, that were herding up their fellow white Russian citizens and Jews and, intellectuals, and, herding them into the field where the Einsatzgruppen would just machine gun them. And these guys were hired by our State Department, acting through the OPC, the Office of Policy Coordination. The guy that was running it was Frank Wisner, who is one of the worst idiots that we've ever had in a responsible position in this country. And of course, he ends up killing himself, but not soon enough, in my opinion, before he brought in, tens of thousands of these dangerous people. And how many of those people's children and grandchildren are now working in the State Department?
Well, and this is the what used to be called the rat line,
Yeah.
or the pipeline that was run by the Dulles, by Allen Dulles. And the stories are there. Now, here's the other tragedy, is that after World War II, there was the Nuremberg trials. There were the ideas that never again will we allow this to occur. And yet we're allowing it to occur. And the irony is that the people who created a nation supposedly to ensure that the Jews were never again targeted for extermination are exterminating the Palestinians. And I want to come back to this point of the courage of the president of Brazil, Lula, who, a lot of people have these images of Brazil as corrupt and poor, and Lula's a gangster, he's a criminal, he was sent to prison supposedly for corruption. What they don't know, and you may not know this, John, do you know who was the U.S. coordinator of what was called the car wash operation, the investigation into Lula?
No, I don't know that.
The Brazilian government, or the Brazilian justice system, which targeted Lula and his successor, Dilma Rousseff, and put both of them in prison. The U.S. coordinator for that was Andrew Weissman. You know that name?
That's the father. Is he the lawyer that worked for the State Department?
No, he was the pit bull for Robert Mueller.
No, I didn't. That's a new name, a new character for my.
This was the guy who went after Roger Stone. This is the guy who was making things up. And the irony is that the Trump people today favor Bolsonaro and favor Milei in Argentina because they're radical free market guys. And they say that the previous governments were corrupt. But who brought down the previous governments? It was the same people who targeted Trump. And it shows what happens when you don't have a strategic understanding of what these fights are about. Lula wasn't targeted because he was a socialist or pro-Biden. He was targeted because he was a nationalist, because he was committed to sovereignty. He was opposed to the neo-colonial system, which had been looting the countries of the global South. And his case was overturned because of the corruption that was involved. He's now the president. And what did Lula say in a meeting in Africa last week? He said that he finds it ironic that the Netanyahu government is treating the Palestinians the same way the Nazis treated the Jews. And Netanyahu went berserk over that. But how can you not see that when you hear people like Itamar Ben-Gvir, who's Netanyahu's national security advisor, say that all Palestinians are beasts, they're animals. When you see Smotrich, who's the finance minister of Israel, saying that we would be better off with no Palestinians here. When you have people in power who are being armed and financed by the United States Treasury, US taxpayers, who are calling for the removal of Palestinians from Gaza. Now, that's what we're dealing with. And so when Lula stood up and criticized Netanyahu, there was a reaction from some of the MAGA people who said, well, Bolsonaro is with Trump, Lula's a socialist, so we have to support Netanyahu. And some of them do it for the reason that they have this view of the Christian Zionists, that you have to get all the ingathering of the Jews from around the world into Israel, and that will be the sign for the second coming of Christ. You have people who seem to be rational, intelligent beings who believe that kind of stuff, including so-called Christian conservatives in the Congress. So when we talk about a nation losing its mind, losing its morality, this is what we see. And yet, when Lula said that, who defended him? Most of the world, including a growing number of people inside Israel who are reacting against the Netanyahu policy. So, I think ultimately, John, if we can get through this period of nuclear holocaust, I think ultimately the evildoers will be punished. But it's going to require a lot of work from the people who are good people, who are still sitting on their hands or still bemoaning their fate, who assume that the good will never succeed, that humans are not really good. Well, if we're not good, we don't deserve to survive as a species. And in fact, that's the view of the hardcore environmentalists, that man is the plague on the planet. But as Mrs. LaRouche said in her 10 fundamental principles, ultimately we have to operate from the standpoint that man is good, that man has a potential to do good and to develop the economy in such a way that it's in harmony with that of the principles of the physical universe. If we don't believe that, then we're just like animals trying to get a bigger piece of a shrinking pie. And that's, of course, what Darwin talked about. That's what the Malthus said. That's what the environmentalists say, that the scourge of the planet is human beings. So, we have to make a decision. Are humans good and potentially creative, or are we just another animal? And, to my dying breath, I'm going to assume that we have the capacity to do good, but we're just not developed to the point that we'll fight for that. And that's what we need to do to restore our education system, our culture. Our culture should be based on this principle that we act for the interests of the future and for the interests of all people in the future.
Yeah, amen. I totally agree with you, except for I'm not as optimistic as you just expressed. I'm really totally concerned about the sleeper agents of bio warfare that are, maybe it's not COVID. Maybe it is. COVID is just a convenient cover for what's really been planned for decades, and that is the increase in cancer and heart disease and other huge health problems that will overwhelm what's left of our economy with money, with expenses of care, and then taking people out. As you just said, your example is perfect. The train couldn't run because the one guy had a cold, or maybe he had COVID, or maybe he got cancer. But whatever it is, the system is overwhelmed. And that's exactly what I think is the aim of this strategic biowarfare. And no, they don't give a damn about humans. They just think we're useless useless flesh in the way. So we have indeed got a fight on our hands. I don't mean we're going to pick up guns, but I do mean that we're going to have to use our brains and our ability to speak out and to convince people that there really is a war going on.
Well, as Martin Luther King said, the arc of history bends toward justice. But there's got to be someone who does the bending. It doesn't do it on its own. And through history, there have been unique individuals who have emerged and presented ideas that were outside of what most people could understand at the time. And yet those ideas, because they were right, ultimately helped to shape a change in human history. And whether we're talking about the emergence of the Republican form of constitutional governments, which, it took how many years of human history before we actually had the establishment of a true republic? And how long did it take for that true republic to get perverted by the disease that was brought here with the British, who wanted to make sure that the U.S. was just a colony of Britain as opposed to an independent country. So we're still fighting these things. We're fighting these battles, and if the arc of history bends toward justice, maybe it's taken hundreds of thousands of years for that to occur. That doesn't mean that we sit back and say we have to accept the troubles that we see in front of us. We have to fight it. That's what it means to be a moral human being, is you don't accept immorality. And it doesn't mean you pick every fight, but I think what Lula showed is that a statesman is one who speaks beyond his country and beyond his immediate interests by recognizing that these are an aspect of natural law. And one of the things we've lost, John, I think as a lawyer, you might know more of this than I do, but the idea of natural law shaping the body of law that we live under, that's not discussed very much, but that was what the founding fathers were discussing. What is the actual nature of the universe and the nature of man in that universe, that we can establish institutions of self-government with confidence that they will succeed.
And yeah, it means it's like our friend Anton Chaikin, Tony Chaikin, when I last spoke to him, he said, the bottom line is we have to be kind to each other. We have to be better. We have to be moral. And, like the Constitution, as someone said, was written for a moral people. If the people aren't moral, it's not going to work. So thank you for another wonderful hour of freewheeling discussion, Harley. And I'm sorry about Europe. You've seen the from the Marshall Plan up to now. I mean, the whole idea is that America will keep Germany down, right? And that's who's keeping Germany down. It's America. It's NATO using European money now. I mean, Europe doesn't have any great desire to defeat Russia. It never has. But
nor does Russia have a desire to conquer Europe.
No.
But Putin said to Tucker Carlson, why would I want to invade Poland? The only time I do that is if they attacked us first.
Yeah. Well, they sure got attacked enough, the Polish people. And well, I just wish peace to everyone, and to keep your eyes open and don't give up the fight. I just a quote from Bob Marley's song "One Love" is some think it's all a part of it. They have to fulfill the book. That's your Christian Zionism, your Christian idea that the Bible is the roadmap for the future of history. And
well, I like to look at what Schiller said in his poem Hope. We are born for that which is better. And what the hoping spirit believes, that we shall never betray. And that's Schiller's view that provides an optimism for our organization.
All right. Well, your namesake, great thinker, great writer, great poet. The inspiration, of course, of the Ninth Symphony of Beethoven, Beethoven is my man, my inspiration. And so thank you so much, Harley, for another day of putting our heads together. And gosh, there's a lot to be done, but as you say, that's our work. We have to have hope and we have to have faith.
All right, John, see you in 2 weeks.
Thank you, my friend. Bye now.
Yeah.